The primary problem I see is that we, the consumers, and I'm talking about, everybody who owns or occupies or rents a house, we don't really know how resilient our property is to hazards that are local to our area. And we don't know how to make choices to become resilient, whether we're in the home buying phase or the home improvement phase and maintenance phase. And to me, that's the missing link, and I'm trying to get this awareness and education and communication at a level where resilience is a high priority in everybody's home-related decisions.
I'm George Siegel, and this is the Tell Us How to Make It Better podcast. Every week, we introduce you to people who are working on real-world problems and providing actual solutions. Tell Us How to Make It Better is partnering with the Readiness Lab, the home for podcasts, webinars, and training in the field of emergency and disaster services. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me on this week's Tell Us How to Make It Better podcast. Every week on this podcast, I try to introduce you to somebody who in their job or in their life is doing something to identify a problem and then make it better. Well, the subject that we're going to talk about today is one that I care a lot about. If you've seen my documentary film, The Last House Standing, we showed all the damage in Mexico Beach, Florida, and the consequences of that damage. Well, my guest today takes it a step further. First, he was in the film and was a big resource for us when we were making the documentary, but he's also involved in putting together a report that went back and revisited the community and looked at all the damage that they experienced and all the problems that continue to linger years after the hurricane hit. The storm may have passed through, but the damage lingers behind for years, and people really need to gain an understanding that it's a long road to recovery after a disaster strikes. My guest today is Aris Papadopoulos. He's an international pioneer in consumer-driven resilience, the author of the book Resilience, The Ultimate Sustainability, and he founded the nonprofit Resilience Action Fund, which aims to empower consumers with knowledge to make resilient choices for their homes. Aris, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, George, for having me on again, and really appreciate what you're doing with the podcast and the film you made and everything else you're doing to improve awareness for consumers. Well,
thank you. And you were one of my early guests when I started this, and it was back at a time when I was just trying to figure out what to do with the equipment, and I had to have you come back a second time to redo the first time. I promise you that will not happen today.
Well, always happy to help for this cause. So, tap on me whenever you feel you need.
No, I appreciate that. And you were a tremendous help when we were making The Last House Standing. For people that have seen the film, Aris was one of the people featured in there and was such a great resource for us. And that's really appreciated on my end. Now, a lot of people see you all the time. We know that you're a big resilience guy, but tell us something about you that most people probably don't know about Aris Papadopoulos.
Well, I'll speak again on resilience. I want people to know that I own and live a single family, single story house in Miami. And I'm self-insured for that house. The house is very resilient, as one would expect from a resilience expert. I'm at 15 feet elevation. The house was actually built in the original house in 1940 and has concrete block walls 1 foot thick. That instead back then of reinforcement, they just poured more concrete in the space between the blocks. Heavy concrete tile roof that has obviously been redone, but will last half a century and withstand a Category 5 hurricane. And I added a generator hooked to natural gas, but backing that up is a 1 week tank of propane. So I don't go anywhere. And when I paid off the mortgage, I said, I think I'm paying too much for insurance, subsidizing, other vulnerable properties. I could self-insure, but it's not for everybody. You have to have, obviously, a very resilient house to do that, pay off your mortgage, and also have the financial capacity to fund any event. And I use the savings, which I estimate now to be around, $7,000 or more dollars a year, just to keep the resilience and maintain that house to be as resilient as possible.
And that's important to tell people, because one of the things I always preach, and I hear a lot of other people talk about, is people need to have insurance. And if they don't, they need to have what you have. Most people aren't in that position. So the rest of us need to make sure we understand our insurance policy, and we're going to talk more about that coming up and why that is. And the last question I've been asking my guests lately, if you've listened to some of the podcasts, it can't be a resilience answer though. You had to go out and do something fun today. What would you go out and do?
Well, I enjoy gardening. My gardener, who was kind of a retired older citizen like myself, kind of had narrowed down his clients over the years, and I was one of the last three. And about a year ago, he told me, "Look, I'm retiring now," and I liked him so much, and I saw some of the other gardening companies, so I said, I really want to continue kind of his personalized attention. So I bought equipment, and I just love it. Trim the trees, and things grow fast in Florida, as you probably know. So it's quite a good workout, but I enjoy it too.
That's good. My idea of gardening is watching you garden, because it's too hot outside to do that. So let's talk about resilience now, and we'll talk about the problem that you've identified. What is it that you see as the primary problem, and what are you doing to make it better?
The primary problem I see is that we, the consumers, and I'm talking about, everybody who owns or occupies or rents a house, we don't really know how resilient our property is to hazards that are local to our area. And we don't know how to make choices to become resilient, whether we're in the home buying phase or the home improvement phase and maintenance phase. And to me, that's the missing link, and I'm trying to get this awareness and education and communication level where resilience is a high priority in everybody's home-related decisions.
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems to take a major disaster for the area that then gets wiped out to have to reevaluate and say, okay, we have to do something. And the community that we featured in the last house standing was in Mexico Beach, which, for people who don't know, is up in the panhandle of Florida. And you called me a while back and wanted to get in touch with some of the folks there about a report that was being put together. The challenge of financial recovery from disasters, the case of Florida homeowners after Hurricane Michael. Tell us about what was going on with that report and what was behind that.
Yeah, basically, having looked at, studies that have been done over years, I saw that there were a lot of studies about, from the insurance perspective, about how the insurance companies have done in response to the frequency of disasters and the severity of disasters. I saw there were also a lot of studies from the government side about what the government had done, but nobody had really gone back to a community that had suffered a major disaster to go back like 3-4 years later and find out, how do those residents, how do those homeowners, those households, how do they do? What effect did it have on them economically and personally? And I said, I need to initiate something in that direction, a survey, going back to a community. So I proposed this topic to the Wharton Risk Center, which is part of the University of Pennsylvania, and they liked the idea. And we said, okay, let's do it together. So about a year ago was when we kind of, decided to implement that. I suggested, and we picked Mexico Beach, which had been hit at that time 3 years, now it's 4 years, by Hurricane Michael and totally devastated. Let's go back and find out how those households did, what they did, what it really cost them, how it really affected them personally and economically. And let's try to put together a report that everybody can really see what the impact is. And I appreciated your help and bring us in contact with some people. So that was kind of the thinking behind that. And we use social media to kind of reach out primarily and word of mouth to the residents there. We offered kind of as an incentive, kind of for every 10, later 20 respondents to a gift certificate, a gift card to kind of encourage participation. And I can talk more about, the participation and the results.
Yeah, there was the report was fascinating. I've read it a couple of times. $25 billion in damage to the area. And that was just unbelievable to have seen it in person and see how devastating it was. 1,700 buildings were in Mexico Beach's city limits. 48% of them were completely destroyed. That's a lot of damage.
That is tremendous damage. And that shows how vulnerable our development has been. Unfortunately, I live in Florida, which is a state that, as you live in Florida too, kind of appreciates the potential damage of hurricanes. But even our state has not really implemented the measures we need throughout the state. Andrew happened, 30 years ago, or is it more? 1990. Yeah, it's 30. It will be 30 years basically this August, and the state upped their standards. South Florida went to the Category 5 standard of construction, but the rest of the state kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, "Okay, this can't happen to us. We're going to build to a lower level, a Category 1 or 2." And guess what? A Category 5 hit up in the panhandle. So we're kidding ourselves by thinking that gambling with nature, pretending that it's not going to happen to us, is a plan, is a strategy. It's not, and it really costs people a lot. And we'll talk about that. From the results of this report, there's a tremendous impact on people, even if they're insured.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is some places in Florida have raised their game and built to a higher standard. The house we featured that was on the beach in Mexico Beach obviously did. The houses around them did not. There were a lot of older homes, and they get exposed pretty quickly in a disaster like that. What is shocking to me is how they still didn't build back to a standard to withstand the next Category 5. And I hear mixed things from that. And when I talk to different experts, some say, well, if you build to a higher standard, the envelope of the house could survive. I mean, I don't know. This stuff's all over my head. Why do you think we're not rebuilding based on what destroyed us the last time?
Well, the reason we're not doing it is because the building industry, the home building industry, doesn't want to do it. And the home building industry doesn't want to do it because they see higher standards as a cost to them and hurting their profits. And the reason they see it as hurting their profits is because we haven't educated the consumers to value the more resilient house and buildings, like we value organic foods and green products and things like that, and we're willing to spend a little extra on those and prioritize those. So we've got ourselves into this chicken and egg situation where we've created a system that tries to stay to the lowest denominator. Which part of our life do we actually run based on the lowest level? Not education, not health, not clothing, not even recreation. And yet the most important decision, the most important purchase in our life, we are at the lowest level. Basically a level that's determined by escape, giving us the opportunity to escape, but not to save our investment, not to save our home, not to save our possessions, not to save, the things we have accumulated, from our life's history that cannot be replaced.
You just wonder what it's going to take for that light to go on and for people to realize that, because I think everybody is taking that gamble and assuming that it's not going to happen to them. Some of the statistics that were in there, a lot of the houses that were destroyed weren't even able to withstand 130 miles an hour. I mean, those were really old structures. So does it take a pioneer to come in and just say, like the Lackey family that just said, okay, we're going to build a house that we know can survive, but nobody around them did. And so it's like, okay, now they have no neighbors for several years while everybody's rebuilding. I haven't been up there. I need to get up there soon to see. I want to see what the area around them is like. Are people building raised houses there? Are they because the storm surge in the report was 9 to 14 feet.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the standards were raised by very little after the event. The wind standard, for example, at the most current one, and obviously, his older houses were built to even lower levels than that, was at 135. This was a storm that brought, let's say, 165 winds, and all they did was raise it from 135 to 140. To me, that's a joke, in terms of a standard. But basically, they said let's do something lip service to show that we're doing something better, and I think they raised maybe the freeboard, kind of the elevation, by a foot or a foot and a half. Again, we're leaving it up to each individual then to decide, well, I got to do better than this minimum level. And that's tough. The industry doesn't work that way. The builders, especially the spec builders, they don't want to build things, to accommodate everybody's desire. So they'll price, if you ask for something different, they'll price it very high and discourage you from doing it. And we're leaving it up to each individual to kind of, make it a priority or not make it a priority. And unfortunately, most people being in a rush say, okay, I'll just do it, to the standard that the county has or the city has now.
Now Hank Ovink, who was featured in our film, The Last House Standing, has a lot of experience from the Netherlands with how they, made it so they would have less damage when they had major storms over there. And he says, how much can you afford to bunker your community? Do you make standards that say, okay, certain life support and essential services will survive, but we're willing to sacrifice these other things? I don't know that people really understand that they're the ones being sacrificed because they're not proactively making a decision themselves.
Yeah. And I think one of the important eye openers from this study, because we have the impression that, okay, the people who suffer are mostly the people kind of in the lower economic categories or the people who don't have insurance. Well, this study was from the demographics that we collected also. This study was mostly middle-class households that had insurance. So we had essentially, the middle class here with insurance, and yet we saw tremendous economic and personal impact that nobody really imagines when they're, thinking of their vulnerability. They think, well, I have insurance, I'm kind of, in the middle income category. I'm not going to suffer very much. Well, guess what? You are going to suffer quite a bit, And so the results here are quite interesting in that the middle class insured is suffering, is taking 2 to 3 years or more to recover, is having to deal with tremendous issues around collecting from insurance, has a whole list of unexpected costs, has to deal with fraud because, we see a lot of fraud descending in these post-disaster areas. A tremendous impact. People essentially have to use up a big part of their savings. You have to use up a big chunk of whatever you're saving for, whether that's education or retirement or whatever. So it sets you back many, many years, even if you're middle class, even if you're insured. And I think if people can appreciate that, then they'll appreciate that maybe that extra 5 to 10% that I spent up front to make my house resilient is the best insurance, not just for the house, but for me personally.
I think people see those Allstate and State Farm commercials where something happens, the agent shows up with a check and everything's back to normal really quickly. Really gives people a false sense of security. I always tell people, look, their goal is to find ways not to pay you. And so if you don't have everything done properly where you can show them everything you lost, and even then, they might still make you wait a long time before you get your money. It's a slow path to recovery to collect money from those guys.
And here's another interesting thing that was kind of an eye-opener to me. And it's in the data, but unfortunately, it didn't make it to the report because Wharton was kind of sensitive at throwing this out because, they work with the government too. We saw from the data that those households that had both homeowners and flood insurance had more difficulties and took a longer time than the households who didn't have flood insurance, just had homeowners insurance. And I started asking why and kind of doing some deeper research there. And what I came to realize, and this is documented in even previous events, is that when you have these two separate insurers, because the homeowners insurer is kind of the private insurance company, and the flood insurer is the government acting through a intermediary, that they have their disputes. One is trying to push costs onto the other. So when a homeowner has both the homeowner's insurance and flood insurance, he's dealing with really two separate entities. The private company insuring his house against, let's say, fire and wind, and other casualties, and the flood insurer, which is the government working through an intermediary for flood events. But if you have both events, then these two entities have to resolve who's going to pay what and how much. And sometimes they have disagreements. And these disagreements can delay you as a homeowner from collecting the money you really need to start making the repairs and moving forward. So we had a lot of the people who were severely impacted, whose houses were really totally destroyed or destroyed to the point where they were, let's say, total losses, had those kind of difficulties. And I think we even looked at the duration. It took on average 1 year more or longer for people who had both to recover. And some of the comments we got were quite interesting. They had to hire a public adjuster to negotiate. They didn't get enough money. It was slow and frustrating. Some even had to go as far as suing the insurers to do that. So, all those headaches and frustrations and costs on top of the losses and the personal impact that they faced.
Now, that wouldn't be an argument, though, not to have both, though, would it? It would just be an understanding that you may have to wait a little longer.
Exactly, yeah. And it's something that, the government needs to resolve because, yes, there can be kind of abuses and losses, but they need to get the money somehow to the homeowner and then work out their disagreements later if they continue to disagree. Don't make the homeowner pay for the differences these two insurers have.
And the other area that was so disappointing to see, and we experienced it with the people we talked to in the film that were victims of fraud. I imagine a lot of people didn't even come forward. Some people probably didn't even come forward and complain about it. But the fraud was unbelievable there of the guys that would come into town to rip people off, whether they were taking their insurance money, tarping their roof for $15,000, whatever they were doing. It was just piling on victims. How do we prevent that?
That's very difficult to prevent because obviously in need and in desperation, people have a tendency to turning to anyone who maybe looks decent, maybe talks decently, but really may not be, the real thing. So people have said, well, make sure their licenses, check the references, do your diligence, do things like that. But to me, the best thing is make sure you're not vulnerable. That I go back to that constantly. If you put yourself in a vulnerable position, you're exposing yourself to a lot of personal risk, a lot of financial risk. And no matter how much we try to control this fraud and overpricing and misrepresentations and shoddy work, I don't think we're going to be able to resolve it. It's one of the costs of disaster, like we have what I call post-disaster inflation. Things are at price A, when in normal times and before disasters. But once a location is impacted by such an event, everything goes up. Materials, labor, things become more expensive. That's something we don't calculate in our cost beforehand. That if it costs you, $1,000 to make something right before, it may cost you $1,500 afterwards to do that. You may have to wait in line even with that. So these are real costs that people have to figure in when they're kind of weighing up front. Should I spend a little bit more money to make my roof stronger or not? Or my windows or doors or garage, etc.
Well, if the answer to this next question exists, I'm not aware of it, and it's not marketed very well to the consumer. And that would be the cost of not doing it index. That would be great to assign to properties so people would understand I'm living in this house, and here's what could happen if things go bad. Then you could weigh the costs like, wow, so it could cost me $50,000 if there's a problem, but it'll only cost me $10,000 to prevent the problem. It seems like guys like you and all those people much smarter than me could come up with a way to calculate something like that. Is that possible?
Well, I think a rating is possible for houses, and I've been working with the World Bank, their private finance arm called the IFC, to develop such a rating. and right now we've tested it outside the U.S. And I want to bring it to the U.S. because they're not interested in developed countries; they're just developing. But I'd like to bring that rating to the U.S. Maybe start training using Florida as a pilot in 2023, and basically be able to say, okay, that house is A rated, that house is B, that house is C, and the lowest would be an R type rating, so that the consumer knows up front, look, I'm looking at a C, and it's not as good as a B or an A, so that house is like a liability. It's a ticking clock that at some point Mother Nature is going to strike, and it's going to cost me a lot, more than I think, even if I'm insured. It's going to cost years of frustration and stress. It's going to eat into my savings and retirement. I may have lost income, especially if you're working from home, as many of us do today. A lot of consequences. So, maybe if I really want to buy that house, maybe I should budget for it to be improved, and the rating could tell you what things you should be looking for. IBHS, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, has created for me the most credible U.S. rating for resilient homes called Fortified, which I would turn to. If you're not building to a fortified standard, to me, you're just exposing yourself. So there are things consumers, if they knew and valued and knew how expensive and costly it is to be vulnerable, as this survey shows, it would be a no-brainer. They'd say, I don't care about the countertop and the closets and the cabinets. I want to make sure that my house is resilient before anything else.
Yeah, they don't even calculate what happens when the business that you're working at is destroyed. Now you no longer have a job, or you're the business owner, or the school has to close because it was wiped out. I mean, there's so many things that aren't calculated, but unless we give people a reason to care, I don't know that they're just going to decide to do it on their own.
Well, I think this survey shows all the reasons you should care. When you look through the lines here and you see how many people had to eat into their savings to make things happen. I mean, how many people experienced acute shortages of money in the month following that? Basically, 2/3 of people had to dig into their personal savings. Okay, 40% lost income, and a lot of them were working from home. They didn't have a home to work from anymore. Or even if part of the home was left, was didn't have power, didn't have communications or anything like that. 20% had to dig deeper into their credit to do that. So, very few actually got money from the federal government, either in a loan or a grant. So, if you're thinking that the government's going to step in and kind of shower you with money, I mean, you're kidding yourself. Very few actually got any money from the government. So you're relying on your own resources. So you're exposing yourself.
Yeah, Brock Long, the FEMA director at the time, told us that the federal government was not going to be anybody's answer to saving them. And he was absolutely 100% right. The other thing that seems to get a lot of people, and I hear stories about this quite often, the hurricane deductible. Most people don't realize there's probably a deductible on their roof. You're not getting a new roof if you have that 2% of your value of your house deductible or whatever. That can wipe people out just with that on its own.
Exactly. Yeah. There's deductibles, and that deductible, for people to reduce the cost of the insurance, those deductibles have been going up over time. So, today you're looking, if you want to, insure a $200,000 or $300,000, value, which may not be the replacement value, lower than that, still at, you're talking about, I remember I had to put a 5% deductible and go to a 10% deductible just to get a reasonable rate, before I became self-insured. So I said, if I'm going to be spending that kind of money, with insurance, why should I not be self-insured? That was another kind of, and then you have caps, all these policies have caps, and they don't consider the increased inflation that we've seen in the last year with all materials and labor and so forth. And they don't consider that, the standard that your house was built to 20 years ago, let's say, is going to be more expensive to meet the current standards that exist. So you're exposed on both ends, the deductible and the cap. So yeah, insurance is something you should have, but the best insurance is resilience. The best insurance you can invest in is to be in a resilient house. And I think every household needs to recognize that and make sure that they do everything possible to prioritize that as number one. It's not the countertops, it's not the appearance, it's not the closets, it's will this home survive a severe hazard that is possible in your area.
Yeah, and getting back to that insurance thing, I would hope that everybody would call their insurance agent and just say, please explain my policy to me if you're not going to read it yourself, and completely understand what you have, so you're not living under a false assumption. But obviously, if building right and avoiding having that happen would be huge. What I thought was interesting also in the report, 73% of respondents undertook some risk reduction in their rebuilding. 73%. So that means 27% did not. They're just rebuilding, which is crazy. Most common was upgrading the roof, which 53% did. The next was windows at 43%. I didn't see much in there about elevating their house or, building something that could actually to proactively think, wow, I just got hit by this. Maybe it could happen again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some of those improvements were because obviously the house was built like 50 years ago, and, it was a cottage, a bungalow, as many of the houses were there, and, the standard has changed. And some were, a few were above the code. But there was another piece of information there that for those who totally lost their houses or had severe damage, 80% did claim that they got no information, neither from the government nor from insurers, on how to build above the regulations to do even better than code. 80% said they got nothing, no information from the government and their insurer. So yeah, they built a code, but maybe they could have done even better, because as I said, the code was not raised very much. Maybe it's better than what their house was before, but it's not going to help them in the next Michael.
Well, both you and I, nobody's going to put either one of us on the cheerleading squad for builders. But I'm just wondering why more of them aren't stepping up and saying, hey, we can fix this problem from our end, and look at all the business we'll get if we educate the consumer. It just seems like a huge opportunity to take something that's really bad, and even if you're selfish about it and say, I'm just going to be self-motivated for my business, it would be a great business angle to be building safe houses, a marketing angle.
It would be. And, we haven't seen that happen. I mean, fortunately, groups like Habitat for Humanity, which is a nonprofit that helps, the lower income people. I mean, they recognize this, and they've upped their standards above code. They're using some of the fortified kind of, measures because they're saying, look, we're trying to help people, and we don't want, to put people in a situation where a few years from now they come back and said, Habitat, you helped us, but we're homeless again, so we're back to zero again. They've recognized this. Unfortunately, the typical home builder is a speculative builder who is looking to keep his investment low, keep his costs low, and make something that looks pretty and sells quickly, And he's feeding off the majority of consumers who have been brainwashed, I say, for several generations by, I put quote unquote, I use them kind of as the scapegoat here, the Better Home and Garden culture, because when you read Better Home and Garden or look at their lovely TV show, 99% of what they talk about is appearance and cosmetics. So that's the kind of education, or I call it brainwashing, that consumers have been put through for several generations. We don't see much talk about resilience, and until we get messages like what you're trying to communicate out there, and talking about this survey, and people realizing that it's an upward curve. The government doesn't. I mean, they did a wonderful campaign between the auto industry, the insurance industry, and the government decades ago on auto safety. I mean, we all remember the dummies crashing into walls, and that left a an image in everybody's mind, including youngsters, that auto safety is something very important, and we spend the money today, in all these auto safety provisions, and even if the manufacturers gave us an opt out, said, hey, you'll save 10% if we take out the extra bumpers and the collapsible steering wheel and the airbag, we'd say no. We don't want to save that 10%. We want those things in there. And if somebody actually did it, his family would be up in arms, so we need to get to that level of awareness, with consumers on homes, and we're not there. We're just at the very beginning.
The auto industry is kind of getting tested, I guess, a little bit on that. I went into a car dealership last month because I love Audis, and they were saying there's no backup cameras or blind spot mirrors right now because they can't get the chips. So for the next couple of months, people who are buying that car won't have those features, and they can't have those features. And I said to the guy, what would you do? He goes, I'd wait. I mean, I wouldn't even think of buying a car without those things. Yet now transition that to your house. People aren't thinking about it. They don't care.
Yeah. So the sensitivity is not there. Why? Because we've been kind of spoon-fed a couple of myths. The first myth is that a house that's built to code and has an occupancy permit is a good, safe house. Well, the truth is it's only safe enough to get you out of the house, not safe enough to survive. The second myth is that insurance will take care of everything. Insurance is a great, protection. And the truth is, yes, up to a certain extent, but it's not going to cover everything. And a disaster will stress you considerably and eat into your credit and personal savings. And the third myth is that the government will eventually help you. So that's the safety net. And the truth is, no, the government is not going to help you. And they're probably going to, put you through a lot of additional stress as you're trying to get some help from them, and it'll just be a few droplets for people. So we've got to dispel those three myths and open people's eyes to the reality.
If I have an older house, is it possible to turn it into a resilient house? Can people do that and still not break the bank, being proactive?
Well, as I said in the beginning, my house was built in 1940.
And you had an exceptional house. I'm talking about, let's say if somebody rode into Mexico Beach before Hurricane Michael, a year before, and said, look, these houses are vulnerable. Could they have done anything?
It depends on the specific house. For example, if the house is built, let's say, less than 15 feet above whatever water level is there, whether that's the sea or a river or even the bottom of a valley, flash flooding if you're inland, it's very expensive to fix that. That's one of the most difficult and expensive things to do. So I would say thumbs down there. Look for something higher ground, because you're looking at a high cost and a high risk at the same time. But let's say a house is on higher ground, but the house is built of wood, let's say, and the house was built at a time when we didn't have the higher above standard codes for tying down with straps and with metal attachments the roof to the walls to the floor. It's possible, but you'd have to get an expert to retrofit that and add those features in. You'd have to tear into walls and do that. But yeah, you could add straps, you could add fasteners, you can add all those metal attachments and strengthen that. You'd have to get somebody professional to kind of tell you if it's possible and how much that would cost, but it is possible. Let's say you have a concrete house, but it was built to a lower standard, and the roof probably couldn't do better than a Category 2 wind. If the walls are strong enough, you could upgrade that roof, let's say, to a higher standard roof to withstand a Category 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 roof, depending on the strength of the walls. So you could do that retrofit, and probably makes sense to do that. Even if you couldn't put that kind of a heavy roof. Fortified has a standard for roofs that at least you could get to 135 miles an hour wind, which is better protection than probably the original roof was only 90, maybe even 80, probably not more than 100. So you could do that. You could change out the windows and the doors and the garage door, at low cost. And let's say, even if you're subject to some kind of flooding, maybe you're not at, 15 feet, let's say you're at 10 feet elevation, you could dry proof or wet proof your ground floor. So either to keep the water out, or if the water does get in, to minimize the cost and damage. So there are things that you could do, let's say, to kind of, protect yourself there. So yes, there's a whole list of things of that property owners could do, but the best thing is to sometimes just knock the whole thing down and rebuild from scratch. But that's a choice. It's a case by case kind of process. But unfortunately, I'd say that the vast majority of U.S. homes, and we're talking about 160 million homes in the U.S., the vast majority have one or more vulnerabilities, because our standards have been set so low for so many decades. And we've been building about 1 million homes a year, during this kind of, home surge. And unfortunately, even most of those homes are vulnerable to one or more hazards. So we're digging ourselves deeper into the hole, not digging ourselves out of the hole.
Well, if you could have your perfect world wish list, what would everybody do after listening to this podcast? What's the one thing everybody should go do?
I would prioritize above anything else, whether you're looking to move to a new home or just looking at future renovations, I would prioritize things that will make your home stronger and able to survive whatever hazards you have, before I do anything else. Before I remodel the bathroom, the kitchen, the closets, those other things, I would prioritize those things first. And yes, they could give you some insurance savings, but more importantly, they'll protect your egg nest, they'll protect your family, they'll protect your possessions. And I personally believe that as we get more and more kind of transparency and recognition, they'll increase the future value of your house more than what you put into it. Because I think as we have more of these things happening and people like you and me talking about it and coming up with tools, people will start smartening up, slowly. And at some point they'll say, I'm looking at this house. It's a beautiful kitchen. Yeah, you got great closets, but, I'm going to have to spend an extra 50, 100,000 to make it more resilient. And therefore I'm discounting the value of this house by that much, And so if you have already done that, I think at some point, and I think it's within 10 years, the market will recognize that and your house is going to be worth more. And if you're vulnerable, your house is going to be worth a lot less. So think of the value and the equity you have in your house as another good reason to prioritize resilience.
Yeah. If your house is still around, and stop rewarding mediocrity of somebody else's work by jacking up the value and buying it and letting them pass their problem on to you. How can people see the report if they're interested in checking this out? Is there a way the public can see it?
Yeah, you should post the link to the website.
I will.
Both the Wharton website and I think I have it on my website too. I can send you that also, so that people can go through that and see for themselves. And I'm hoping to do more surveys like that. I kind of asked Wharton, they haven't kind of come back to me, but I'm looking to team up with others who would like to go to other locations 3-4 years down the road and say, okay, let's check and see how they fared, because I think there's a big pattern here, and I think we need to bring the awareness and the spotlight more in the public eye.
Absolutely. I would hope anybody that lives in a vulnerable area would check that out. We'll put a link in the show notes too. And also the shameless plug of your book. How do people get this book?
Well, it's now available on Amazon. I also made it into a audiobook, Audible, because I've kind of become an audiobook fan myself. So you can listen to it on Audible. It's also available in Spanish. So, There's a Spanish version of the paperback too. And I'm in the process of writing my second book, which will be kind of focused on the economics of resilience and kind of, the financial side. And I hope to have that complete, let's say, beginning of next year and out.
Excellent. Well, listen, Aris, thank you for being my first repeat guest. I appreciate you coming on. I love the work you're doing. That report is fantastic. And I wish people would take this as seriously as we appear to be taking it and do more.
Well, I'm honored to be part of your effort, and thank you for everything you're doing. And let's try to make another documentary happen. This is so valuable for the public.
Absolutely. Thanks, Aris. Thank you for listening to this week's Tell Us How to Make It Better podcast. Links to get Aris's book and to get the report will be in the show notes for this episode. And there's also a contact form if you have any thoughts about what you've listened to or what you'd like to hear on future episodes. Please reach out to me. I would love to hear from you. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.